At Manila's airport, billionaire Reed Vale was used to ignoring the world beyond the glass of the VIP lounge, until two sisters appeared with a battered suitcase covered in tape and scribbled words. "This case is a school." Their voices were steady, but desperate, pleading over a baggage fee they couldn't afford. Inside the case weren't clothes, but chalkboards, books, and letters from children clinging to their only chance to learn. Reed could have looked away. Instead, one question, and one decision, pulled him into a story that would change everything. He did not see them at first. He saw the glass of the VIP lounge reflecting the late afternoon glare off the tarmac, the sweep of attendants in teal, the slow choreography of luggage carts drifting like beetles between the silver bodies of planes. He saw his own face, at once too tired and too awake, overlaid on the moving airport, angular, expensive, curated in all the ways that mattered in pictures, and none of the ways that mattered at 3 in the morning when he woke up with his jaw clenched. Reed Vale, whose signature trailed the bottom of acquisition contracts that could make 1,000 livelihoods evaporate and 1,000 others crystallize, saw the world, but not them. At least, not until the lounge door pressed open and the sound of small wheels dragging over tile snuck in before the chilled air could close it out again. They were just beyond the rope line, tiny in the frame of the doorway, two girls pulling a single battered suitcase. The older one had the practical stiffness of someone who had spent weeks doing hard things and had learned the rickety usefulness of keeping your chin up. The younger had her palms spread on the suitcase's handle like a prayer. The suitcase itself was what made the tableau refuse to dissolve into the general blur of travelers. The suitcase, with its patchwork of stickers and handwritten scrawls, the gouged corners taped over with strips of neon tape, the letters across its front in careful block handwriting. This case is a school. Reed looked away automatically, the way a man looks away from a street performer or a fundraiser or any unexpected human plea that ambushes him on the way to a meeting. He did not need to. He could have signaled the server and channeled his discomfort into the alcohol menu. He could have, and for 3 years of muscle memory, he almost did. But the younger girl's voice floated in, pitched to the clerk at the reception desk. "Our flight is at 5:30, she said, as if she was explaining to a teacher she idolized, as if time itself was a gentle animal she could coax. The older girl, 17, 19, tried to smile and failed. "We just need to print the boarding passes," she told the clerk, who had the poised apology of hospitality staff everywhere frozen into his face. "And, ask about the baggage fee. We were told, someone said, there was an email that says—" "It's standard for the second checked item," the clerk recited. His eyes drifted toward the lounge behind Reed as if to gather permission from the wealth glinting there. 3,000 pesos due at the counter. "We only have— It's for the school. It's equipment, not— There's a program for— We read that certain educational equipment is exempt." The older one's words tripped. She had rehearsed them in her head and could not find where they were supposed to land. The younger squeezed the suitcase handle tighter. "It's the projector and the books," she said, "and the board. The hinges are— It opens like this." Her hands fluttered to indicate. Reed turned his eyes toward his reflection again. He had a meeting in Tokyo at 10 a.m. the next day. He needed sleep on the plane and quiet, guiltless hours over the Pacific to flatten his mind into a sequence of operations. When he and his team had purchased the offline payments network in Jakarta, he had spent 3 weeks in transit and 15 months negotiating with 19 regulators. He had learned to treat airports like he treated coffee, something you used, and not something that could reach back and touch you. "Sir?" The lounge attendant had materialized at his elbow to ask if he needed anything else. Reed almost said no. He almost said whiskey. He almost smiled the thawed half-smile that was the most efficient way to move through rooms like these. Instead, he heard his voice say, "What's with the suitcase?" The question surprised both of them. The attendant blinked. "I beg your pardon, sir?" "Out there," Reed said with a tilt of the chin that did not require him to stand. The girls. The attendant looked where Reed nodded. "Ah, they were directed here by someone at the main desk," he said. "They can't access the lounge without a membership." He glanced at Reed's black titanium card on the table, the one that had to be presented on arrival, as if show and tell never grows old at a certain altitude. "What did they say?" Reed asked, and tried to keep irritation out of his tone. Not at the kids. At the part of himself that had been dragged out of its invisible booth to care about something that would mess with his carefully portioned energy. They were asking to waive a baggage fee for educational equipment. The attendant's eyes softened very slightly. He wasn't supposed to soften. Wealth melts, softening quickly. "They have a note," he offered, grateful to be able to produce paperwork. Reed's first thought was, someone's running a scam that's newer than the old ones. His second was a memory, involuntary as a sneeze, the taste of powdered milk on his tongue, the smell of old book glue. He was 6 years old in an apartment over a laundromat, and his mother had penciled letters on index cards because the school wanted $30 for phonics materials, and $30 might as well have been $30,000. This case is a school. The suitcase had said. His mother's suitcase had been a real suitcase, cracked brown vinyl that had smelled of mothballs, but she had made it a school on nights she didn't cry. He stood up because it was easier than not. It was, he told himself, a low-cost intervention. He could hand the girls his spare access card and disappear back into his cocoon. He could pay a fee because it was petty cash. He could be the kind of person who did things that made newspaper columns flinch and also occasionally bought people their coffee in line like it was a personality. Outside the rope line, the older sister was pinching the bridge of her nose as if to hold her composure in place. The younger had rotated the suitcase, presenting its front like an exhibit. "This case is a school." Below that in smaller letters, "Ela Readers." Below that in even smaller script, squeezed to fit, "Please, please, please take care." "Hi," Reed said from right behind them because it was better than having to clear his throat. The younger sister spun and nearly clipped his shins with the suitcase as she pulled it back. "Oh," she said, and then repeated, "Oh," as if the second one could pick up the first and carry it. The older sister looked him up and down. She had the eyes of a person who learned early that looking up and down might keep you safe, that spotting trouble and advantage were the same skill with different outcomes. "Good afternoon, sir," she said, and did not add anything that would ask him for anything. "I can handle the fee," Reed said, and realized he hadn't introduced himself. He didn't have the right way to introduce himself to anyone anymore. You say your name, and the internet says the rest for you, unless your name is intentionally meaningless in the world outside your life, and then you say you're first, and people are gently uninterested, and it is a grace. If they knew who he was, their faces would transform, and Reed was too tired for that kind of magic trick. "I overheard," he added, which was a lie. He had overheard the tone and not the words until the last minute. The older sister shook her head once. "That's kind, sir," she said, "but we've been careful with the budget. We just need the exemption to apply." "The exemption doesn't apply on domestic segments," the clerk at reception supplied, apologetic. "International educational equipment, yes. Domestic, no. The policy is very specific." "You can't argue with a policy that's had a lawyer touch it," Reed said mildly. The sisters glanced at him. He had made a joke without trying to. The thing about a career in which you move unimaginable numbers around is that you forget how to be funny to a person on the other edge of imagination. "I mean," he amended, "you can argue, but not with someone whose job depends on not changing it." The younger sister blinked. She had an almost aggressive openness to her face, as if the world were a door she kept her fingers in the hinge of to ensure it could not close. "Sir?" she asked carefully. "Why would you pay a stranger's baggage fee?" Reed shrugged like it was nothing and felt the old armor close over his shoulders. "Because I can," he said. "Because it will take me 1 minute, and you two look like you have had more than your share of minutes taken from you. Because—" He checked his impulse to make it a lesson and stopped. Because I like the handwriting on your suitcase. It's my handwriting, the younger one said instantly. Pride warmed her voice, even as the older shot her a look that said, "Stop volunteering everything." "Nice letters," Reed said. "Isla readers?" "Our program," the older answered. "I'm Calla. This is my sister Mara. We visit islands where there isn't a permanent school or there's only a multigrade class, and we take the school with us. Not all of it," she amended, because accuracy mattered to her. "Not even most of it, but we take enough that some kids learn to read sooner than they would have. We take enough that others don't forget over the monsoon." "I could show you," Mara blurted, and knelt to wrestle with the latches before anyone could warn her that airports are not the place to demonstrate anything. The suitcase lid creaked. Reed saw hinges installed with loving incompetence. He saw straps and a fold-out blackboard scarred with chalk ghosts. He saw a tiny projector in foam. He saw sliding drawers labeled with marker, vowels, numbers, maps, stories that feel like candy. He saw a pocket swollen with paper letters. He reached for one and stopped himself. "May I?" he asked, and Mara brightened like someone had plucked a string inside her. "Please," she said. "They're from our students." The letter he chose at random was on yellow paper, and the letters were canted left as if trying to sprint away. "Dear Ate Calla and Ate Mara," it said. "My mother said when the rain stops she wants to give you banana turon. I read to my cousin now. Please bring the story about the dog who eats the wind again." Reed swallowed a heat in his throat that always surprised him when it showed up, like spotting someone you loved across a street you didn't remember agreeing to cross. He nodded as if to himself. "Let me handle it," he said to the clerk. 3,000 pesos? "The fee is per additional item, sir," the clerk said with relief, "plus tax." "Then all of it." Reed pulled out a card and watched the way Calla's mouth pulled tight. He could see the shape of her patience. He had known patience like that when he was 22, and had a code base he believed in and a bank account that pulsed between 0 and not 0. "We're not asking for charity," Calla said softly. "I'm not thinking of it that way," Reed said. He tried to lighten his tone. "I'm thinking of it as paying a tax to the policy gods. Do you want me to write a check instead so it feels more like a transaction? Or I can invoice you, and you can pay me back in banana turon." Mara giggled. Calla's eyes flicked to Reed's face as if to look for the thin wire of mockery that so often hid behind offers like this. She didn't find it and looked more confused. In the end, she nodded a tiny concession. "Thank you," she said. "We need to get to Tablas tonight. The kids know we're coming. We have a schedule." Reed paid. The lounge attendant did something with a complicated combination of stamps and a kind of satisfaction that was not exactly customer service and not exactly subversion, but tasted a little like both. The clerk printed receipts that felt like reprieves. "Wait," Mara said suddenly, mid-gratitude. "If we don't take it now, it won't fit in the overhead. The handle gets stuck, and the cabinet on the small planes is—" She squinted, trying to conjure a measurement with her fingers. "This big?" "Gate check," Reed said. "They'll tag it and take it down the ramp and meet you on the tarmac when you land." He forgot to be embarrassed at the way the words hopped out. These were things you learned after a lifetime of airports. The way you learn the names of the birds in your neighborhood, not because you love them, but because they chatter outside your window and won't be quiet. Mara executed a tiny bounce. "Thank you," Calla said again, and Reed thought, "This is what it cost me to be the kind of man I told myself I was going to be." And then he thought, "No, this is just the entry fee." And then he caught himself thinking it all and shook the thought out of his head. They were just girls with a suitcase. He had meetings that turned systems like theirs into interesting case studies in white papers. He had a private Slack channel named after a color where grown people with salaries debated how to make their boss look like a human. He was not going to Tablas. When he had his boarding pass in hand, he sat back down and texted his assistant. "The Tokyo dinner remains on," he wrote. "But can we pull the morning brief forward by 20 minutes? Traffic from Haneda is going to be a mess." He watched the speech bubble on the screen pulse. He watched the girls at the rope line, how they shifted the suitcase between them as if rehearsing new choreography. The lounge attendant returned a minute later. "They wanted to thank you again, sir," he said, "but the gate started boarding. They were worried about overhead space." "Of course," Reed said. He picked up the yellow letter again. He thought of his mother's hands smelling like dishwashing liquid and stale cigarettes, of the way she had looked at him when she had boxes of books on the table and needed him to be the sort of child who made all of her choices worthwhile. He folded the letter and put it in the pocket of his blazer. He told himself he would throw it away on the plane so he would not have anything awkward to explain at security. He did not throw it away. He read it again, and then, when the jet started down the runway and the cabin stilled into that suspended hush that always made him feel like time had popped out of joint, he read the other letters he had pocketed without meaning to. He read about kids who slept 2 to a bed, 3 to a bed, 6 to a room. He read about a boy who memorized a map of the whole archipelago and announced that he would invent a way to keep boats from capsizing. He read about a girl who drew a library on the back of her door and a boy who copied sentences into wet sand with a stick because that felt like owning them. When they landed in Cataclan, the island heat tackled him like an old friend. He did not see the girls at first in the shuffle of gate check retrieval. He did not need to. He had done his part and could go on with the business of being a person who sits in a moving airport, untouchable. But the tarmac was a small democracy. The passengers streamed down the stairs into the wind, and bunched up where a sunburned baggage handler in an orange vest waited with a trolley of fluorescent-tagged items. The suitcase was easy to spot even before Reed knew he was looking for it. "This case is a school," it said, and among the roller bags, like sensible cousins at a family reunion, it looked like a scrappy child with scabs on their knees. The baggage handler lifted it with exaggerated care, smiling at the girl's squeaked, "Thank you." The handle stuck as predicted. The older girl showed him how to slide a metal pin in and coax it out. Reed found himself at their side, neither on purpose nor by accident. The world had drawn a chalk line on the ground, and he had stepped across it. "Connection?" he asked, not sure if he was intruding. "Boat," Calla said. "We have a sponsor who lent us a tricycle to get to the port. The boat leaves at 6:20. We have 13 minutes. Reed looked at his watch and then at the sea cut into glitters by the late sun. He could see the dock from here, the line of bankas waiting like dragonflies. "Plenty if your driver believes in muscle memory more than traffic laws." Mara grinned. "He used to race," she said. And then they were sprint walking toward the exit, the suitcase clattering behind them. Reed could have waved and peeled off to the right toward the private cars, the sign with his name on it, spelled correctly by someone he paid to care. Instead, he kept stride. He told himself there was a story he could tell his board next quarter about the texture of markets, how real life at the last mile defines which ideas live or die. He told himself a lot of things, and none of them sounded right, but they kept his feet moving. The tricycle was painted the electric green of bad sodas and had a plastic rosary looped around its mirror. The driver, a thin man with a high forehead and the aura of a retired myth, nodded at Calla and Mara as if to say, "Of course I was born for this." Reed climbed in because the other option was to stand there and admit that time didn't always ask permission to reorder itself. They zipped through streets that smelled like frying garlic and exhaust and river, narrowly missed by dogs with the self-possession of princes. They reached the dock in 5 minutes, because sometimes everything conspires in your favor to make later regrets more pointed. At the ticket window, Calla pulled out their reservation code like a winning bingo card. The ticket seller shook his head with a plea in it. "Fully booked," he said. He had the look of a man whose job was to disappoint people while trying to convince them he wanted the same thing they did. "A storm in the channel. We combined 2 departures. If you have VIP." "We don't," Calla said, and her voice strained around a word she had probably decided never to say out loud because it tasted like begging. She considered pleading and decided against it in real time. She turned to Mara. "We'll take the morning boat. It means we'll miss the first morning session. We'll text Atelina to gather the kids for the afternoon." The morning boat is also full, the ticket seller added painfully. You can wait list. The cargo takes priority after the storm. Reed opened his mouth and shut it again. He had money. Money is a bridge, a glove that makes the world a little easier to hold. But sometimes the bridge ended midair, or the glove could not catch what mattered. The girls did not cry. They had traveled in all the ways that teach you the futility of tears. They shifted from plan A to plan B to plan C with a practiced grace that made his chest ache. Is there a cargo boat that takes passengers unofficially but also officially if you know how to ask? Reed tried. He expected a no. He got something more complicated. There is a boat, the ticket seller said slowly, that will take you if you can vouch for your own life. The captain, he knows everyone. He owes many favors, but he does not like the rich. Reed was about to protest that he had no intention of being liked when Mara chirped, delighted, "We don't either." Calla stifled a laugh, gratitude sneaking through the worry. "We can vouch for our lives," she said. "We've done it a few times." The cargo boat's captain was a man with a face like a geography lesson and a laugh like falling coconuts. He surveyed the suitcase with interest and Reed with suspicion that glinted like a bottle on a beach. "You are one of the men who moved the bank into the phone," he announced, the way a man tells a story to a potential enemy. Reed did not ask how he knew. People knew things all the time. "I'm one of the men," Reed agreed. "You make it easier for the city to take the island's money and call it progress." The captain chewed on that and then spat it into the sea. "But you paid a baggage fee for 2 girls with a school in a box." He tilted his head at Mara, who stood with hands on hips like a general. "I will take you if you don't touch anything, and if you don't talk to me about payment platforms." Reed put his hands in his pockets to prove good intentions. "Wouldn't dream of it," he said. The crossing was rough, wind plucking at the boat like a nosy ant. Mara threw her face into the spray like it was church. Calla sat stiffly, the kind of stillness that keeps motion sickness at bay and also keeps many other kinds of fear from sloshing around. The suitcase wedged between Reed's feet like an heirloom dog. He touched the corner without thinking and felt a ridge of duct tape under his finger. "What happened to the hinge?" he asked, because asking about things is a way to pretend you're part of them. "First version had the wrong screws," Mara said. "We kept moving the screw through until it found wood. It kept eating the wood. We learned about washers." "And the projector?" He had run dozens of boardrooms through the arcane rituals of plug and play, and still, the presence of a projector outside a conference room felt like contraband. "Donated by a guy who runs movie nights in his barangay," Calla said, her body remembering that gratitude can be an antidote to disappointment. "He gave us his backup because he said the backup does not change lives in his closet." "And this," Reed said, nodding at the pocket with the letters. "Payment," Mara said. "We are very rich in that currency." She grinned, and Reed had the dizzy sense of sliding down a hill into a lake you had forgotten was there. "What's the plan?" he asked when the island rose up ahead of them like a sleeping animal. The sun had slouched toward the water. The first stall lights winked on at the dock. The air tasted like smoke from cooking fires and salt and something sweet he couldn't name. "When you land." "We go to the community hall," Calla said. "We set up the board. We mark out the reading circles and plug the projector into the only outlet that works if you hold the wire at a certain angle." She smiled. "We bribe Junjun to stand there and be a human clamp for 2 hours by promising he can be in the first math circle. We meet the mothers, then the kids. We run a story circle and a sound circle. We don't fix anything. We just remind them their brains are very good because no one has told anyone that in a while." "And then?" "We sleep with 12 cousins," Mara said. "Then we wake up and do the same thing until we have to go home and convince sponsors we are responsible, and then we plan to come back because leaving is the worst part." Reed looked away so he would not have to manage his face. He was good at asking questions that made him look kind. He was less good at letting the answers sit and rearrange him. The boat nudged the dock as gently as the storm would let it. The captain hawked and spat again, then extended a hand to Mara, then to Calla, then, with a snort, to Reed. "Do not fall," he said, "or the rich will have to say the poor saved him, and that will ruin my reputation." On the island, the suitcase took on a new gravity. On the tricycle, in the lounge, on the tarmac, it had been an oddity, an object intruding on commercial flows. Here it was a ritual object, all hands offered to lift it, to carry it, to open it. Moms with babies stuck under their shirts like Lucky Charms pressed forward with the same urgency they brought to buying rice and paying electric bills. Kids slithered in and out of legs like fish. The hall was a concrete rectangle with murals of dolphins and a mural of Jesus holding a lamb, and the kind of acoustics that made a cough sound like a confession. Reed stood near the door and tried not to look like a man in a suite at a child's birthday party. Calla and Mara turned the suitcase into a school like the stagehands in a theater, change a set without the audience noticing the miracle. The board unfolded. The projector yawned and glowed. The drawers breathed chalk and markers and cards, and the smell of palm trees drawn in two tight rooms in children's hands. The community electrician came and held the wire at the right angle. Yunjin materialized, a wiry 8-year-old with the solemnity of a priest and eyes that did not miss the improvement in his bargaining position. "We'll need your mighty strength until the second story," Calla told him, mock serious. "I require at least one math circle and possibly two," he replied, a businessman negotiating a deal. "Two is excessive," Mara said serenely, "so we'll call it 2. Reed leaned against the doorframe and let something unclench. He did not belong. This did not melt him into belonging. That would have been simple and false. But he felt the way you feel when the weather changes and your body says, "Yes, remember this." He listened as Calla's voice found that frequency where it thins to go over many heads like a web, and Mara became an amplifier for it, darting into gaps with jokes and demonstrations, contagious attention. He expected to leave. He had a hotel an hour away that would feed him a lonely salmon, at a table with a napkin folded like ambition. He intended to go through the motions of the life he had taught himself to live. Instead, he stood until the first-story circle began, and then, without planning, without calibrating his optics, without telling his assistant, he sat. A little girl with a scar on her forehead chose him like a cat chooses a lap, not because of who he was, but because he was where he was when she needed to sit. Mara assigned him 5 kids whose eyes were barely peeking over the edge of printed letters and whose hands moved independently from their intended tasks like small birds. "Point under the words as we read," Mara said, as if he were a volunteer the school had been training for weeks. "Say the sounds, not the letter names. Be silly, it helps." "Be silly," he muttered. He had paid $8 million for the smile that made people tell him things. He had designed an entire fleet of professional behaviors to keep people from breaching his perimeter. He was not silly. He tapped the first lines with his finger. "Man," he said with an exaggerated that made one of the boys hiccup with laughter. "What does that spell?" "Man," he said, proud of himself. "Close," Reed said, and tried again. His mouth tried on a dozen new shapes. "Man." "Man," the boy repeated, roll-calling a species. The little girl who had chosen his lap traced the letters with a fingernail. "Dog," she said, pleased to find a friend on the page. "Does the dog eat the wind?" Reed asked without thinking, and the little girl nodded furiously as if he had given her permission to attach the day's story to the story she had already loved. Later, when the kids had run home to carry this thing that had happened around to show to their grandmothers and cousins, Reed went outside to call Tokyo and say he was going to attend the dinner remotely. He did not offer a reason. The board chair began to say words that were sharp and coded. Reed let them snag him and then let them go. "We will sign," he said. "We have already done the work. You need me less than you need the certainty of believing you need me. I'll join at 9. He hung up and leaned his forehead against the rough wall of the hall for a second longer than he might have if anyone had been watching. Calla came and stood next to him without pretending not to notice him. "Thank you," she said, "for coming." "I paid a baggage fee," Reed said, and then gestured with his chin toward the kids' footprints on the dusty floor. "You do this, and then you leave." "And then we come back," she said, unbothered by his implied accusation. "This is not ceremonial. The suitcase is not a mascot. It's a bad compromise that works better than no school. It's also not ours. It's a thing we pull with kids for a while, until the next thing." "What's the next thing?" "A teacher who can stay," Calla said. "Salary, a roof that doesn't make learning impossible when it rains." She smiled crookedly. "A governor who doesn't think a photo op is a substitute for policy." "And the thing after that?" "A childhood where this isn't radical," she answered. She said it like she was ordering at a bakery. "A childhood where a suitcase school is a story people tell about the old days when things were worse." Reed thought of his own progression from suitcase to server room to private jet. He thought of the slope he had climbed and the switchbacks he had used and how many people had been expected to clap at the summit. He thought of the ways money smooths and the ways it chisels. He thought of his mother's hand on his head when she had been too tired to teach him and had just loved him instead. The yellow letter in his pocket grew heavy and then very light. "What if I bought you 10 suitcases and 10 tricycles and 10 projectors?" he asked, because generosity inside his own idiom felt safer than listening. "Then we would be able to go to 10 more places," Calla said, "or 4 more places with fewer breakdowns." "What if I built you a school?" She didn't laugh. People had laughed before to make him feel like he had said something charmingly impossible. She didn't ask him who he was to be talking like this. She looked like a person standing on a beach looking to see if the tide is actually turning or if it's a trick of the light. "Then we would have to make sure the teacher inside it is the kind of teacher who doesn't wander off when something shinier appears," she said. "And the roof would have to be fixed before it broke, and the toilets would have to work, and the barangay captain would have to not rent it out for weddings every weekend." He felt himself smile for real. "Logistics," he said like a prayer. "Life," she said like a correction. The storm finished its story that night, and the air stilled. Reed went back to his hotel, which smelled expensive and a bit like a hospital. He showered with water that never slowed, slid into sheets he had not washed, opened his laptop, and attended a dinner across the sea. He made decisions that would ripple out into other people's mornings. He took the yellow letter out of his pocket and set it next to his computer like a talisman or a joke at his own expense. He looked at the kind of man he had been in his head for a long time, and at the kind of man he had become, and he admitted there was a crack between them that had gotten drafty. He sent an email to his head of comms and told her not to send a photographer to the island without a request. He sent another email to himself containing a list of words that should not appear in any press release he might be tempted to approve in the next year. Savior, transformation, uplift. He scrolled and scrolled, looking for something that would confirm that what he was now considering was a diversion, a midlife marketing pivot, a story with an arc and an end. In the morning he went back. He held wires for Yunjun and counted man with boys whose fathers woke up before dawn to risk their lives on the sea. He watched a girl's eyes widen when a story took her somewhere she had not known she could go while staying exactly where she was. He asked Calla quiet questions about how she had learned to make an organization out of a good idea. He asked Mara 100 loud ones about the rubber bands, the secret compartments, the good markers that did not require shaking. At mid-morning, when the kids ran outside to scream for 5 minutes and then fling themselves back into the room in order to be fully human again, Reed crouched beside the suitcase. He ran his hand along the edge. Under the neon tape bruise, there was a faded imprint of a brand name. It was his first company's logo, the one he had sold 12 years ago to a man who had killed it and then sold the carcass for parts. It wasn't that the suitcase was from his company. Those models had been sold all over the world and had been durable enough to outlast his attachment to being that person. It was that the past comes back in objects, in cheap hinges and cheap vinyl and demands you stop pretending yourself was not made of practical parts. He laughed at himself and almost said it out loud. He slid his hand into the pocket of letters and felt an envelope among the papers, heavier than the rest. It had his name on it, not his last name, his first. Reed, written in a round hand he did not recognize. He looked around and then, feeling ridiculous, said, Did you put this in here?" Calla glanced over, read his face, and shook her head. "Sometimes the kids write letters to the people who help us," she said. "They put names they've heard us say on the radio or when we are planning. We tell them your names when we write grant applications, but only if we think you're the kind you can put on paper without it making our stomachs hurt." She smiled. "We don't say those names out loud in the community unless the person wants it." He opened the envelope. The letter was from an older hand, written in proud slanted script in black ink that had blotted once in the middle of the page. "Dear Reed," it read, "I am probably old enough to be your grandmother. I have 8 grandchildren, and 4 of them are learning to read with your case. I don't know who you are, but the girls say you paid for them to bring it. Maybe you are not rich, maybe you are very rich. Both kinds are strange to me. But my father told me when I was a girl to always look for the thing that eats nil dreams and to feed it sweet things, so it does not eat you too. This case eats the bad dreams and leaves the good. If you are the kind who forgets why you are doing things, I hope you will remember this on a day when your brain is full of other people's voices. I will make Turan if you come." He folded the paper gently, like it was something that would want to be folded with respect. He found that his eyes were full of the blur that makes men like him make jokes about air conditioning and sinus infections. He didn't make the joke. He put the letter back, then took it out, then put it back again. He imagined his boardroom and the long table and the glare off the glass and the way this would sound in those sentences. He imagined himself carrying the suitcase into that room, setting it on the table, opening it to draw out sounds and stories. He imagined their faces. During lunch, Mara brought him a plate with rice shaped by a bowl and a pile of eggplant and long beans and something that tasted like fire in a good way. "Do rich people eat with their hands?" she asked, curious, not mocking. "Some of them," he said. "On holidays, I grew up eating with my hands when we were short a fork." "We are short a fork a lot," she said, frank, "but we are not short a mango very often." "I can confirm mango is superior to fork," Reed said gravely. She laughed again, that clear note that went through him like a needle and threaded opposites together, a laugh like new rope. He stayed until mid-afternoon. He did not sign anything except spelling sheets. He did not make promises, because the first rule of making the world briefly better is that you must not make promises you cannot keep when you go back to your life. He watched Calla teach a mother how to draw letters to teach her daughter to draw letters. He listened to the way the women compared hunger without dramatizing it. He listened to the way the men teased each other for carrying chairs and then carried twice as many chairs. He watched the suitcase swallow and vomit an entire temporary civilization. The economy of it made him giddy. When it was time to leave because the cargo boat would not wait for a man in leather shoes no matter what his last name was, he found Calla and said, "I don't know if you need anything from me beyond what I did at the airport." "We need 8 things a day," she said without calculation. "But if the thing you have is not one of those 8, we still like company. You are allowed to be a person, not a wallet." "I have a foundation," he heard himself say, and winced at how predictable he sounded. "It's discreet." She raised an eyebrow. "The discreet ones are the only ones I can stomach," she said. "Send us the form you make everyone fill. We'll choose which questions to answer." He nodded. He took a breath. He said, "I would like to come back." "You're allowed," she said again, as if he were 8. "Bring your hands." On the boat he let the wind slap him awake. He looked at his phone. His assistant had sent 17 messages, 3 with exclamation points that signified people somewhere were collapsing under the weight of the fact that he had not been exactly where he said he would be. He typed 3 messages back that started fires and put them out. He scrolled and found a draft email he had been writing to his mother for 2 years since she had died. He didn't know what he had meant to put in it. He added, "I found a suitcase that made me remember you took a pencil and turned it into a key." He stared at it long enough that the words lost their shape and became ink. He hit send. The server would bounce it back to him because there was nowhere to put it. He wanted it bounced back to him. At Cataclan, he walked through the terminal behind a young couple arguing about their honeymoon itinerary and a grandfather teaching his grandson to slap flip a bottle cap. He reached for his wallet automatically when he saw a woman at the counter crying and remembered that money is not a universal solvent, even though it sometimes behaves like one in enough situations that you get cocky. He saw a news alert on his phone about a regulator stepping down and another about a giant fund taking a position in a company he had once wanted to buy and had not. He opened the email app to send his head of product an article about offline mobile for rural clinics, and then stopped, not wanting to turn the day into content. The lounge attendant recognized him and asked if he needed anything. Reed said, "Water," because he did not know how to ask for what he wanted. He slept on the Tokyo flight with the slow, relieved descent of someone whose nervous system had been allowed to live outdoors for a few hours. In the morning, he handled Tokyo like a man who knew how to divide a day into squares and color them in. He ate a bento box that looked like a grid and beat 2 people he admired at Go, the game in which territory is not conquered but inferred. He returned to Manila before dinner, a pendulum he had wound and was obliged to be. At his hotel, a package was waiting for him at the front desk with his name in a round hand. Reed lifted the lid as if it might be a snake and found a small plastic container of banana turan, still warm, still slick with sugar. There was a note on top. It was from the grandmother. "Dear Reed," it said, "if you come back, we will show you the story about the boat that eats storms. For now, eat this so you remember you have a mouth for sweet things, too. P.S. The girls say you need to eat while you pace when you are on your calls. They say to put 1 in each pocket for those times." He laughed, and then did the thing he had promised himself he would not do. He texted his head of comms a picture, not for a post, for a human being. He typed, "There are stories we need to stop telling about what money does. There are others we need to tell better. Let's stop turning the work into content and start turning the content into work." He ate 1 turan, then another. He put 2 in his pockets because the grandmother was bossy in a way that felt like being folded into a family. He opened his laptop and wrote to his foundation director. Subject line, "Suitcase." Body, "Find me the people who make hinge washers in bulk. Find me the people who can write curriculum that assumes intelligence and chaos. Find me the engineers who can withstand not being the hero." Then, he added, "Find me the patience to do this in ways that will not destroy it." It would take months to build anything that did not collapse under its own PR. He would need to learn to get out of the way. He would need to not be the star of the thing. He would need to sit with the suitcase on his lap and let other people pull it open. At the airport again a week later, a man in a suit, the cost of a motorcycle, stopped him as he passed the lounge. "Mr. Vale," the man said, already reaching for the selfie, "I heard you were seen at the port last Friday. Someone said you paid for 2 girls' bags." He gave Reed the grin of someone who admires other people's philanthropy the way he admires an unusual car. Nice headline. Reed looked at him for a long second, then at the line of people being told that their weight was wrong, that their time was wrong, that something had been moved, and they had to move too. He thought of the grandmother's P.S. He put a turan in the man's hand. "It was a baggage fee," he said, "not a headline, and the girls paid me back already." "How?" the man asked, chewing. "By not letting me make it about me," Reed said. He left the man standing there, sticky fingers and all, and walked toward his gate. He passed a family checking in at the counter, their suitcase held together by a belt, their faces arranged for impact. He caught a glimpse of marker on canvas. The words were almost the same, but not quite. "This case is a choir." He smiled like he had been told a secret and kept walking. When he made it to the island the next time, the hinges had new washers. The projector had a backup for the backup's backup. Yunjun had moved on from wires to leadership, which meant he now told other kids how to do the thing he had done and watched them do it with an expression of quiet possession. Calla rolled her eyes at a governor who had shown up for 15 minutes and 3 photos, and then went back to making reading circles inside a storm of bodies and noise. Mara added a drawer to the suitcase labeled, in large, proud letters, "Stories we are writing now." Reed tried to write one. He failed in ways that taught him where languages live in a body and how they hide when you scare them. He handed his pen to a girl who had a scar like a hyphen on her cheek, and she wrote a line that made his throat go hot. "The wind does not ask permission to go to school," she wrote. "It just goes." He thought of the boys in his world who asked permission from no one and took it as a sign of power and bristled at their good opinions of themselves. He thought of the wind. He thought of the suitcase and its stubborn latches. He thought of how doors open sometimes when you don't deserve it, and how the only currency that makes sense in the end is attention. He gave it as if it were money he had not known he'd been hoarding. On a night after the 3rd visit, Reed found himself on the phone with a journalist he trusted enough to tell no story to. "I hear you're changing the Foundation's strategy," she said, unsheathing her curiosity like a friendly knife. "I'm trying to change the person who thinks he knows what strategy should be," he said quietly. "We are going to spend on things that don't look good in pictures. We are going to pay boring salaries for boring work done by people who are good at boring work. We are going to stop pretending innovation is a synonym for speed. We are not going to tweet about it." She laughed. "Good luck," she said. "Call me when you need me to, not write about you." He said thank you and meant it. Then he sent money quietly and signed a contract more loudly and turned down a panel where he would have been asked to tell a tidy version of a messy truth. Months later, a board member asked him, "What do you want your legacy to be?" He had asked others this question and never listened to the answers, because answers to that question have the shape of interviews. He thought of a suitcase being slid under a bed with care so that nothing came loose. He thought of Mar A's handwriting swinging across the front like a flag. He thought of children's fingers smudged with pencil that would wash away and the stubborn graphite that would not. He said, "I want to build things that don't fall apart when no one is watching." "And your company?" the board member asked, a man who could turn compassion into a subheading. "Will stop describing itself as building the future and start behaving itself in the present," Reed said. The board member tried to reposition the remark into something that could be sliced and quoted. Reed slid the yellow letter across the table and watched him read it. He watched the way the man's mouth tightened and then relaxed and then did something else. He watched him be a person. He took the letter back and put it in his pocket because it belonged in a pocket near a body. He wished he could return it to the grandmother and tell her that he had fed the thing that ate bad dreams and that he had learned the taste of duty without reward. The next time he saw Calla and Mara at the airport, it was at the departure board where the lists of cities flipped with mechanical satisfaction. They had another suitcase, not a replacement, but a sibling. "This case is a clinic," it said. Reed raised an eyebrow. Mara flourished her hands. "Immunization charts," she said. "A scale for babies, bandages with cartoons, a stethoscope that doesn't make children think of their dead uncles." "And you," Calla said. "What's your suitcase say now?" He thought of the one at home, the gray Italian thing that was less a suitcase than a display case for frictionless living. He thought of the pockets he had begun to fill with small things that did not seem like much to anyone else, and that made his hands feel useful when he took them out. "I think mine is a little less empty," he said. Mara beamed. "Good," she said viciously, as if emptiness were an enemy she was pleased to see him pick a fight with. "We need the space for books." He paid a baggage fee without asking, and nobody argued with him this time because there is a kind of credit you can carry that does not sit in a bank. He watched the girls walk toward their gate, the suitcase clattering behind them, and he eased himself into a seat, knowing he would resist the lounge, that he would sit with the noise and the ordinary sorrows and the unearned pleasures of people moving between places because of reasons that might be large or small or neither. He pulled out the yellow letter with the blot in the middle and read it again. The words had not changed. He had. When his flight was called, he stood with his ticket in his hand and the Turon in his pocket, and the feeling that the world had tilted in a direction that made walking both easier and harder at the same time. He passed a new poster near the gate, a corporate advertisement for a bank app promising that everything could fit in your phone. Reed looked at the glossy image and thought of the suitcase. All of it doesn't fit, he thought, but enough of it can be carried if you build the right handles. He walked down the jet bridge with a sense of being very young and very old at once, the way you sometimes feel when you have just learned how to say a word you thought you already knew. He thought of the first time he had walked into an airport as a child and believed the planes would swallow him. He thought of the women who had unlocked his brain with a pencil and a voice. He thought of a suitcase that had declared itself a school in a world that did not particularly like to agree that education is allowed to be invented by girls who cannot wait. He thought of the man he had been when he had looked through the VIP lounge glass and edited the world down to what he could use, and he felt grateful and a little ashamed for how long that had worked. On the plane, he buckled his seatbelt and leaned back and, for the first time in a long time, did not open his laptop. He closed his eyes and listened to the roar and the hush. The sound that is how metal says it will trust physics for a while. He imagined the suitcase below, with its new hinges, with its old letters, with its loud declaration scrawled across its front like a shout. This case is a school. He smiled. He would carry it when it was his turn. He would lift when lifting needed doing. He would hold the wire at the right angle while somebody else told the story and looked the children in their eyes and made the room warm. The plane rose. The ground tilted. The light changed. And even there, suspended in a machine that made distance ridiculous, he could feel the weight at his chest shift into a kind of ballast that kept him steady. He put his hand over the pocket where the letter lived and thought, sweetness can be a tool if you know what you're doing with it. He thought, I am learning to know. He thought of Calla and Mara and the already half-planned trip in his calendar titled only, Bring Your Hands. He laughed softly out loud, and for once, no one asked him if everything was all right, because for once, without an asterisk, it was. Reed returned to Manila, and as the weeks slid into months, he began noticing something he had never really allowed himself to before, the small ways the world tried to remind you of responsibility. A child selling sampaguita at a traffic stop, eyes too old for her face, a teacher in a faded blouse carrying stacks of papers twice her size on a jeepney, the sweat on her brow betraying both exhaustion and determination. A headline buried on page 6 about another public school in the provinces closing down because of lack of teachers. He caught these things not because they were new, but because he no longer had the armor to edit them out. Once you had seen a suitcase turned into a school, it became impossible to look away from everything else. The letters in his pocket multiplied. The grandmother wrote again, neat lines pressed down with a firm hand. The children sent drawings of boats with wings, of chalkboards that grew roots like trees, of faces smiling with teeth missing but joy whole. One boy drew Reed himself, tall and angular, his hair wrong, but his hands holding up a suitcase with "Thank you" written across it in block letters. Reed had laughed when he saw it, but the laugh had carried with it a sting of longing, a longing not for thanks, but for the clarity those children seemed to hold, a clarity he had been chasing in acquisitions and boardrooms, but never caught. He flew again to the islands, but this time without announcement, without entourage, without even telling his assistant beyond a single-line email. Out for personal reasons. Back Monday. He arrived at the same dock, and Calla met him with the calm welcome of someone who had decided a long time ago that gratitude did not need to be loud to be real. Mara squealed when she saw him, dragging the suitcase over and declaring, "We made a new drawer. It says dreams we haven't had yet." She flung it open with theatrical pride, revealing an empty space. "We're supposed to fill it with the kids." Reed stared at the empty drawer longer than was reasonable. Something about its vacancy reminded him of his own life, the compartments he had left deliberately empty, convincing himself that emptiness was a strategy, that control required space untouched by others. But Mara's drawer was not sad. It was waiting. That distinction hit him harder than any negotiation table ever had. At night, he sat under the corrugated roof of the community hall, listening to children stutter their way through the new words, their syllables breaking and mending like fragile glass. He found himself teaching, too, showing them how to form numbers with the precision of a man who had once loved math, not for money, but for magic. One boy, no older than 10, leaned against him after finishing his first multiplication set and asked, "Does this make me rich now?" Reed almost said no, but instead he smiled and said, "It makes you dangerous." The boy blinked, confused. Reed clarified softly, "It makes you the kind of person who can't be tricked as easily. Numbers are armor, stories are weapons. You're learning both." When he flew back to Manila, something odd happened. The board noticed. They noticed not because his performance dropped, but because it improved. He was sharper, calmer, more decisive in meetings. Risks that had once consumed him with anxiety, he weighed with clear eyes. "What changed?" one director asked. Reed almost answered, "I met a suitcase," but instead he said, "Perspective." He poured money into the foundation, but carefully, surgically. No headlines, no ribbon cuttings. He funded stipends for teachers willing to stay in remote islands. He built quiet partnerships with local builders for sturdier classrooms. He funded new suitcases, 50 of them, each one a mobile library, each one with hinges tested to last. But he refused to put his name on them. Instead, every suitcase bore Mara's handwriting. "This case is a school." The children believed it because the words were written by a child's hand. That mattered more than his billions. One evening, he returned again to the island, finding Calla exhausted, but still standing at the front of a circle of mothers who had gathered to learn letters alongside their children. Reed stood at the back, unnoticed, watching the way her voice carried authority without arrogance. Later, when the hall emptied and only the echo of chalk remained, she looked at him and asked, "Why do you keep coming back?" He didn't answer right away. He thought of the airport glass, of the reflection he used to hide behind, of all the faces he had ignored because they complicated the neatness of his life. "Because leaving feels like theft now," he finally said, "like I'd be stealing something from myself." Calla studied him, her eyes weighing him in silence, and then she nodded once. "Then stay as long as you can. But remember, it isn't about you." He laughed, not wounded, but freed. "I know, that's why it feels real." Years began to pass, and the story of the suitcase spread in whispers across communities, in markets and in boats, in radio programs late at night. People spoke not of Reed Vale, billionaire, but of two sisters with a suitcase and the children who carried it. Reed was mentioned rarely, and when he was, it was simply as the man who paid the baggage fee. That suited him perfectly. One day, long after his hair had grayed at the temples, he returned to the island for a celebration. The suitcase, patched, scarred, but still alive, sat in the middle of the hall like a guest of honor. The children who had once learned their first words from its drawers were now grown, some in uniforms, some in aprons, some carrying children of their own. They spoke into the microphone one by one, their voices steady, their English or Tagalog or Bisaya, weaving stories of what the suitcase had meant to them. Mara, now taller and wilder but still with that same defiant grin, leaned toward Reed and whispered, "Told you it was dangerous." He chuckled, eyes warm, "More dangerous than I ever imagined." And as the night filled with songs and laughter and the smell of food, Reed realized the truth. Wealth had once meant control, but now it meant surrender. the surrender of letting others hold the story, the surrender of being content as a footnote in a tale much larger than himself. He had not built empires in this hall. He had built something far rarer: continuity. When it was time to leave, one of the younger children pressed a new letter into his hand. It was written in careful block script. "Thank you for paying the fee. Because you did, we paid the rest." Reed smiled as the boat pulled away, the island lights flickering like fireflies behind him. For the first time in his long, meticulously calculated life, he felt not like a man escaping deadlines or chasing deals, but like a man carried forward by something larger: a suitcase, a story, and two sisters who had taught him that sometimes the smallest hinges hold open the largest doors. And in that realization, he finally knew. He had not just invested money, he had invested himself, and for once the return was not profit. It was permanence. Reed held the letter in his hands long after the boat had cut through the black water, the sound of its motor fading into the wide silence of the sea. The handwriting was uneven, the ink smudged in places, but it carried the weight of something no fortune could buy. He turned it over again and again, feeling the rough edge of the paper as if it were a reminder to stay awake to the world, to never fall back into the comfortable blindness he had once lived in. For years he had been surrounded by contracts and signatures, legal language polished by lawyers, until every word was stripped of its humanity. Yet here was a note written by a child whose biggest investment was belief, and somehow that felt more binding than any deal he had ever signed.